Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday.
Good afternoon, everyone.
The date right today.
The day right
Happy
today.
Friday, and I got the date right today.
Oh,
the day right today.
Well,
It's gonna be a little crazy in here.
Well,
Okay.
it's gonna be a little
As this
crazy
week
in
comes
here.
to a close, I want to take
Okay,
a moment to highlight the incredible
as this week comes to a
progress
close,
the president
I want
has
to
made
take
for
a
the
moment to
American
highlight
people
the
in recent
incredible
days,
progress
from expanding
the president
affordable
has
health
made for
care
the
to
American
lowering
people in
costs and
recent
tackling
days,
inflation,
from expanding
to
affordable
bringing
health care
manufacturing
to lowering costs
and
and
jobs
tackling
back
inflation,
to our shores,
to bringing
President Biden
manufacturing
started the
and
week at
jobs
the
back
North
to our
American
shores.
Leaders Summit
President
in Mexico
Biden
City,
started the
where
week
he
at the
spoke
North
for
American
2
Leaders
hour
Summit in
close
Mexico City,
cooperation
where he spoke
with Mexico and Canada to address
close
shared
cooperation
challenges that
with
impact
Mexico and
the American
Canada to
people.
address
Challenges
shared
like
challenges
combating
that impact the American people. Challenges like combating climate change, COVID-19 pandemic, and transnational criminal organizations that are trafficking and smuggling people, as well as illicit drugs like fentanyl. The president spoke to our work to take thousands of smugglers off the streets, catch record levels of fentanyl before it even reaches our border, strengthen border security, and increase resources for border communities all over the opposition of Republican governors and Republican members of Congress, I might add. We've also continued taking action to lower health care costs for American families, made possible by President Biden and congressional Democrats' enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act. On Wednesday, HHS announced its historic plans for Medicare to directly negotiate lower prescription drug costs. In addition, starting this month, seniors on Medicare are seeing their insulin costs capped at $35 for a month's supply. They are also now able to get recommended vaccines for free. All of this thanks to, again, the Inflation Reduction Act. HHS also announced record-breaking enrollment number of healthcare coverage on the Affordable Health Care Act marketplace. Nearly 16 million people have signed up for this open enrollment period for healthcare coverage, a 13% increase from last year. And it includes over 3 million people who are brand new to the marketplace, and we're not even done with the open enrollment yet. Because of the cost savings measure in the Inflation Reduction Act that President Biden signed into law, millions of Americans are continuing to save $800 per year on health insurance on average. And 4 out of the 5 healthcare.gov enrollees can find coverage for $10 or less a month. All of this adds up to real impact and meaningful progress to expand affordable, quality healthcare coverage for American families. And that matters. That matters to the American people. We also had exciting news on the economic front as well. On Wednesday, as you all saw, the largest solar investment in U.S. history, a direct result of the president's economic plan and the Inflation Reduction Act again. This $2.5 billion investment in Georgia will create 2,500 jobs. And yesterday we learned that for the 6th month in a row, inflation has indeed come down. Annual inflation has fallen to lowest level since October of 2021, and gas prices are down by more than $1.70 from their peak, thanks in part to the president's actions to increase oil supply, which were also historic actions that this president took. This is further proof the president's economic plan is working. Even though inflation is high in most major economies, it's coming down in America and giving families more breathing room. You hear the president say that all the time, how he wants to make sure that he's giving American families a little bit more of a breathing room. At the same time, the president is building an economy from the bottom up and middle out, with the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, nearly 11 million jobs created, and historic manufacturing investment, like I just mentioned, totaling nearly $300 billion in major investments across the country. And as we end this week, on Friday the 13th, as somebody marked, today, President Biden welcomed Prime Minister Kishida of Japan to the White House. We will have a joint statement out for all of you shortly, laying out their conversation and their discussion this afternoon. But I can tell you that the two leaders are discussing the unprecedented actions we have taken together to better equip us for the 21st century challenges, as well as working to deepen our cooperation on everything from economics to technology to fighting the climate crisis, advancing peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific and around the world. Today's visit is a testament to President Biden's investment in our alliances and partnerships since day one, since he walked into the administration. And a historic week is leading into a historic weekend. I am so happy and glad to be joined by my colleague and former mayor of Atlanta, senior advisor for public engagement, Keisha Lance Bottoms, to talk about the president's trip this coming Sunday to the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church to remember and honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. this Sunday, as I just said. I know many of you had some interest here, so we wanted to make sure that she was here to answer any questions and to lay out why this day is going to be so important. I do want to say on a personal note, as Black women, we have broken barriers. This church and the day honoring King are near and dear to both of our hearts. I know on a personal level, we are both looking forward to joining the president on this trip and being in what has been the epicenter of the movement from civil rights in this country for decades. With that, Mayor Bottoms? Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's kind of scary up here. All right. As Karine mentioned, I am looking forward to joining the president as he travels to Atlanta this weekend. As many of you all know, in Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, he expressed many ideals that he would not live to witness. But I stand here, and many of you sit out there as beneficiaries of that dream, his sacrifice and service. So I am eternally grateful for that. As Karine mentioned, the president is traveling to Atlanta. This is at the invitation of Reverend Warnock, and the president will deliver a sermon at Ebenezer Church, which of course was Dr. King's church, also Congressman John Lewis's church. The president spoke with Senator Warnock last night. Senator Warnock has been the pastor since 2005 at Ebenezer. They had a wonderful conversation about the significance of this historic event, including the fact that the president is the first sitting president to speak at a Sunday service at Ebenezer in its history. This would have been Dr. King's 94th birthday. As we know, this is an inflection point in history, and the president will deliver remarks reflecting on Dr. King's life and legacy, and the way that we can go forward together. Following his trip to Atlanta on Sunday, he will join Reverend Al Sharpton on Monday at the National Action Network, which Monday, of course, is the official celebration day of the King holiday. The president will deliver the keynote speech there. And then finally, before I take any questions, this is an important day. As a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, it's our Founders Day, our 110th Founders Day. So the president did a lovely video for the women of Delta. Also, our Secretary of HUD, Marcia Fudge, was also a former national president of Delta. So the president, the vice president are very grateful for all of the support of the women of Delta and the Divine Nine, and happy Founders Day.
All right, we'll take a couple questions.
Can I ask you if, as in your role in community outreach, whether the issue of the documents is a particular setback for the president at a moment when other things seem to be going pretty well, inflation's coming down, employment is solid? Like, are you finding that you're getting a lot of response from the public on that, and how do you play that issue?
In my role as senior advisor for public engagement, we've not gotten any information on that in terms of from the public. We've not received any questions.
And do you anticipate that that will have any bearing, or is causing the president to think at all about, as he's making his decision about whether to run again, will this series of discoveries have any bearing on his thinking and his thought process as he decides whether to run?
I'll refer those questions to the president. He can speak for himself on that.
While the president's in Atlanta, what do you expect his message to be on voting rights in particular? And given that the situation in the Senate remains virtually unchanged when he spoke about this issue in Atlanta last year, is he considering any additional executive action on this issue?
Well, the president has been very clear that we need Congress to act. He's asked for Congress to codify the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and also the additional Voting Rights Act that's pending before Congress. That's the Freedom to Vote Act. So the president has been very clear that voting, the right to vote, the access to vote is a core component of our democracy, and he's going to continue to push for that.
Including on Sunday at the church?
The president will speak on a number of issues at the church, including how important it is that we have access to our democracy. And you can't come to Atlanta and not acknowledge the role that the civil rights movement and Dr. King played and where we are in the history of our country. But we still have to push forward. We still have more work to do.
And just one other thing, do you expect him to have any engagement with the King family while he's down there?
We do expect that. I know on previous Sundays, previous King Day services, and many Sundays prior to the pandemic, Dr. King's sister in particular is often at the service. I don't know if she will be there this Sunday. And we also expect other members of the King family to be there as well.
In regards to the voting rights, last time around this time when President Biden went to Atlanta, some of the civil rights groups and voting rights groups skipped the speech out of concern that the White House wasn't doing enough to push this issue. Aside from wanting Congress to do more, what is the message to those who feel the White House is not doing enough?
Well, as I've been in this role as senior advisor to the president since June of last year, we have engaged with civil rights leaders. He's had them at the White House in a round table. I'm in constant contact with them. And I think that it's very clear that the president is doing everything that he can in his executive power to lean in on voting rights. But we need Congress to do more. This is important. If you've come through the East Wing, you've seen the pictures of Dr. King meeting with Lyndon Johnson, meeting with other civil rights leaders, hashing out voting rights in the White House. And so the fact that we are still here talking about this in 2023, I think really speaks to the fact that we need action. We need that action from Congress. The president has done and will continue to do all that he can do in his executive powers, but there's only so much that he can do. We need Congress to act.
Is the feeling then that he has exhausted what he can do, his powers from the White House, his executive powers?
Well, if there is more that he can do, we welcome those suggestions. But as I stand here today, it's my understanding that we have done all that we can do from the executive branch. Now we need Congress to act.
Yes, thank you so much, Mayor Lyons, for being here. Really appreciate it. When you look at the economy, you saw the unemployment rate come down last month, and yet it went up for Black women, for Latinos. What is your reaction? How focused is this administration on trying to make sure that the recovery is equal, is helping African American women?
Well, equity is at the center of what we do from this administration, and so that's extremely important. It's been said that when America catches a cold, then Black America catches the flu. Well, that's also in relation to the economy. We often know that communities of color and those communities that often face additional challenges have additional challenges with the economy. The great news is that the economy is doing much better under this administration. Also, the president is going to continue to lean in to make sure that we have access to resources that are specific to communities of color, that are specific to women, to give us those opportunities to be successful in this economy.
Do you anticipate him addressing that in his remarks on Monday?
I know that he will generally speak about where we are just in terms of helping those who are in need in our communities. I don't know if he will specifically address the economy. But as you all know, during Dr. King's last major campaign before his assassination, it was called the Poor People's Campaign. And what we know is that from this administration, many of the focus areas have been aligned with what Dr. King was focused on at the time of his assassination. That's making sure that we are creating this beloved community, free from hate, free from poverty, giving people access to resources so that they can have what they need to compete and succeed.
Thank you. Thinking back to the 2020 campaign, part of the president's strategy at the time was going to visit these churches to engage some of the voters that he needed to turn out for him. In South Carolina, there was the 16th Street bombing anniversary that he spoke at in Alabama, and also on hand in Selma for Bloody Sunday. Is this speech at Ebenezer the start of a similar outreach campaign heading into 2024?
I don't know that it's the start of it, but it could be a great start of it. I know that the president is very interested in connecting with people, hearing directly from people. It's the best way that any elected official truly hears and understands the needs of people, and there's no better place than to do that than at Ebenezer. Reverend Warnock has not just been very vocal about the challenges and the issues that are facing people as a candidate, but also as a pastor. And Ebenezer is a cornerstone in the Atlanta community, and I'm sure the president will get an earful on what our needs and our desires are for our country when he's there.
Can you provide any insight into the writing process for this speech? I know that oftentimes there's a lot of time paid attention to speeches like this. How long the president's been working on it for?
We've been working on it for a couple of weeks just as a team, and of course with the president's input. And as with any major speech that the president is giving, he gives his input, and the team takes it from there, and then he takes his pen and he says what he wants to say, and you'll hear that on Sunday.
Okay, is it finished?
No.
It's never finished. Okay.
Just one question. Obviously, Democrats had a big victory in the runoff election in Georgia. He's going back to a historic Black institution to speak of this church. How do you see the state, your home state, kind of fit into the political landscape going forward now?
Georgia's pretty important. I think I've always thought that. Now the rest of the country knows it. We know that Georgia's played an important role with how our Senate is now comprised, and I expect that role will continue to be just as important in future election cycles. Okay, and remember, I just have to say this, Georgia did go for Joe Biden, all right?
Go ahead, Ebony, last question.
Just a couple of questions. First, whether it be on Monday or on Sunday when he's at Ebenezer, is he going to be meeting with any civil rights organizations at any point during any of those visits?
Well, as I mentioned, on Monday, he will be joining Reverend Al at the National Action Network. There'll be many civil rights representatives there. There will be many at the church who will also have an opportunity to connect with the president while he's there.
Nothing separately?
Nothing separately, but there will be some engagement while at the church.
And at the policy forum with Reverend Al Sharpton, when he attends the NAN event, what kind of policies can you talk about that you know that they'll be talking about on that day? Or what kind of policies do you think that we can kind of expect to hear the president talk about even following that? I know that Rev has been talking about criminal justice reform quite a lot and had several other meetings. Can we see the president pick back up on those same messages following this?
Well, the great thing is that this is not a one-time engagement. Reverend Al and some of the other civil rights leaders, I believe from 8 other organizations, were in the White House a few months ago, sitting down with the president, sharing their concerns. My office, me personally, I'm constantly engaged with these civil rights leaders, so we're hearing in real time what our challenges are, and I think I can safely say that we have confidence in many of these leaders that we are doing what we can do and will continue to do more as we can to make sure that the needs of our communities are met.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
How did you feel the President Biden picked Kamala Harris instead of you for running mate?
Okay, thanks, everybody, and thank you so much, Keisha. Appreciate it. I have a couple things at the top that I just want to go through. This is the week ahead, so all of you have this. Before we take questions. So later today, the president's going to travel to Wilmington, Delaware, as you all know. On Sunday, as you just heard from Mayor Lance Bottoms, the president will travel to Atlanta, Georgia, and deliver a sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And on Monday, he will return to Washington, D.C. to join Reverend Al Sharpton and the National Action Network at their Martin Luther King Jr. Day breakfast, where he will deliver the keynote address. On Tuesday, the president looks forward to welcoming Prime Minister Mark Rutte of the Netherlands to the White House to further deepen the historic ties between our two nations. As strong NATO allies and global partners, the two leaders will reaffirm our shared efforts to strengthen transatlantic security and economic prosperity. After that bilateral meeting, the president will welcome the Golden State Warriors to the White House to celebrate their 2022 NBA championship. And next Friday, the president will welcome bipartisan mayors attending the U.S. Conference of Mayors winter meeting to the White House. The president will deliver remarks celebrating the achievements of the past 18 months and focusing on the bipartisan work that needs to be done to implement these and other historic pieces of legislative victories at the local level to make a difference in people's lives across the country. With that, Chris, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Question on a couple different topics. Speaker McCarthy has invited the president to deliver the State of the Union on February 7th. That just went out. Is that the date that the president plans to give the State of the Union? Does he accept that invitation?
So we have received Speaker McCarthy's kind invitation, and the president has accepted it. And looks forward to delivering the State of the Union address on Tuesday, February 17th of 2023. So we are, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, guys. On Tuesday, February 7th, 2023, but we truly appreciate the kind invitation by Speaker McCarthy.
On the debt limit, Republicans want to cut spending as part of a debt limit deal. Is the president willing to cut any spending as part of a debt limit deal, and what would he be willing to cut?
Look, as you've heard us say before, we will not be doing any negotiation over the debt ceiling. But broadly speaking, at the start of this new Congress, we're reaching out to all the members through the Office of Leg Affairs, making sure that we have those connections with those new members, as I just stated. But I want to say, like in the past, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again, there's been a bipartisan cooperation when it comes to lifting the debt ceiling, and that's how it should be. That's how it should continue. It's not and should not be a political football. This is not political gamemanship, and this should be done without conditions, and that's how we see this process moving forward.
When you say that there'll be no negotiating, you will not negotiate anything involving spending?
What we're saying is that this should be done without conditions. In the past, we have seen this. We have seen both Republicans and Democrats come together to deal with this issue. It is one of the basic items that Congress has to deal with, and it should be done without conditions. So there's going to be no negotiation over it. This is something that must get done.
And does the president agree with the Treasury Secretary, that the debt ceiling should be eliminated?
Again, I've spoken to this before. That is not, no one is talking about eliminating the debt ceiling or the debt limit. That's not what we're talking about right now. Congress is going to need to raise the debt limit without conditions. So that is not what the discussion that we're having.
Very last thing, have White House officials been interviewed by the special counsel or by the Justice Department involving the classified documents?
So what I will say from here is any questions that we may have about the review, about the process, I would refer you to the Department of Justice. I would also refer you to my colleagues over at the White House Counsel. I'm not going to get into any specifics from here. Go ahead, Mary.
Aside from the special counsel, aside from this review, I just have a question about processing classified documents and their handling, because I think there's some confusion amongst the public and even in this room. What is the process to make sure that classified documents aren't accidentally or intentionally taken when a president or vice president leaves office? What's the protocol, or is this sort of just a review system?
It's a good question. I would, on the process and how that works, I would certainly refer you to the White House counsel's office. They would know that. They can walk you through that. My colleagues there, and I know many of you have been in touch with my colleagues in the last 24 hours, in direct touch, and answering many of your questions. So I would refer you to them on the specific process, so that they will certainly guide you in the right way.
But as far as you know, is it ever okay for classified documents to be mixed with personal evidence?
What I can say, look, what I can say is what the president has said before, what I have said multiple times. We take this very seriously. The president takes classified information, classified documents very seriously. But look, you know, I've said this before. We have addressed this issue multiple times at length. And we have been fully cooperating with the Department of Justice, and now we will be doing the same with the Special Counsel's Office, just to be prudent here and just to make sure that we are consistent. I would refer you anything that is related to this, as it relates to the review, to the Department of Justice or my colleagues at the White House Counsel Office, and we see it as the best way to move forward. We want to respect the process, and so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to refer you to the Department of Justice.
Just to be clear, you're confident he followed whatever protocol was in place?
Again, this is something that he takes very seriously, the president, when it comes to classified documents, when it comes to classified information. I'm not going to go into any specifics from here. If you have any questions, anything further that's related to the review, or I will refer you to the Department of Justice or my colleagues over at the White House Counsel's Office, who I know many of you who I'm staring at right now has been in close touch. Go ahead, Ed.
A few things, Karine, thank you. Following up on the State of the Union, I believe it was the president who suggested he has spoken with Speaker McCarthy. Are there any plans for them to meet in person before February?
Yeah, they spoke, and I think we actually shared that with all of you. The day that Speaker McCarthy became Speaker, you saw a statement from the President and the First Lady congratulating Kevin McCarthy becoming Speaker. And then the next day, I believe that was on a Friday, I believe the next day, which was a Saturday, the President had a direct conversation. He connected with Speaker McCarthy and congratulated him in person.
But no plans yet for
I don't have a plan. I don't have a scheduled meeting to share with you at this
I
time.
wanted to follow up on a few things from yesterday. When was the president informed about the Attorney General's decision to appoint a special counsel? How and by whom?
So, the specifics on that, here's what I can tell you. I can tell you that we were not giving a heads up. I was asked that question yesterday. We did not know that the announcement was going to come yesterday until after it happened, so I can clear the deck there and let you know. Anything else specific to when the president knew or anything that's related to this, I would refer you to the White House Counsel's Office. I know many of you that I'm looking at right now has been in close touch with my colleague there. And so I would continue to refer you to my colleague at the White House Counsel's Office.
One of the things that they finally confirmed for us is that Bob Bauer is indeed the president's personal attorney handling some of this. Given that the Justice Department cited the personal counsel as having made this initial outreach to National Archives and has been in touch with the Justice Department, is that the person who these questions should be directed to? Why the White House Counsel?
I will say this again. Whatever the White House Counsel, my colleague told you in your conversation, I know you guys just spoke or connected earlier today, I would ask them that question. And anything related to the review, I would refer you to the Department of Justice.
And regarding the extraordinary measures that the Treasury Secretary announced a little while ago in advance notice to Congress, is there a policy that requires her to give advance notice of those plans? You
have to reach out to the Department of Treasury on how that process works. What I can say is, just so that everyone knows, folks who are watching, the debt limit is projected to be reached on Thursday, January 19th. At that point, Treasury will begin to take extraordinary measures to prevent default. Secretary Yellen did not name a specific X date, if you will. The day Treasury would no longer be able to pay the government's obligations, but quoting from the Secretary's letter, it's unlikely that cash and extraordinary measures will be exhausted before early June. But that does not mean that Congress should not wait until then to raise the debt ceiling, as we have been saying over and over again. The sooner Congress acts, the better, since even the prospect of not raising the debt ceiling will have damage the full faith and the credit of our nation. And again, we are going to continue to encourage Congress to act. But as far as the steps and how this all works, I would refer to the Department of Treasury.
6 days till the 19th. A few years ago, she did it about 10 days beforehand.
I understand. I would refer to Department of Treasury.
Nothing to it being announced today amid the situation that the White House is facing.
I would refer to Department of Treasury. And just to be very clear here, Ed, I've been in here almost every day since we got back from Mexico City, standing here taking your questions at length. So that we're not avoiding anything here, and you've heard from the president at least twice, and we have put forth multiple statements from the White House counsel's office. So that suggestion I just disagree with. Go ahead, Kristen.
Karine, thank you so much. Does the White House and does the president agree to fully cooperate with the special counsel investigation?
We have said that we are going to continue to fully cooperate. We have been. The president's lawyers and team has been fully cooperating with the Department of Justice, and they're certainly going to do that with the special counsel.
And so by that reasoning, would the president agree to sit for an on-the-record, in-person interview?
I'm not going to get into specifics or get ahead of what's going to happen. I'm not going to get into hypotheticals because that is a hypothetical. What I will say is we have addressed this multiple times at length, and we are going to continue, the president's team is going to continue to fully cooperate with the Department of Justice, and we respect that process, and that's what we're going to do.
The president has said he hopes to speak about this soon. When can people expect to hear from him about this?
Don't have, again, that is something that I don't have a magic wand here. I don't know when that's going to happen. What I can say is his team is going to fully cooperate with the Department of Justice. Let's not forget, the president said during the campaign that when it comes to the Department of Justice independence, he respects that. And that is something that he had said was incredibly important to make sure that they had their independence. That's why we say we're going to make sure that they have their independence, and that's why I'm saying that we're going to refer to Department of Justice.
And let me just ask you a big picture question here. Does the White House, broadly speaking, have an obligation to share not just with the National Archives, but with the American people when the existence of classified information is found in a private location?
Again, there is a process in this.
But just big picture, not necessarily in this instance, but is it the policy of the White House that they should share that information not just with the National Archives, but with the American people?
So I'll say this, Kristen. We have been transparent in the last couple of days. Remember, there's an ongoing process, and we have spoken when it is appropriate. And we have shared, again, I've been here almost every day, not every day, but from Wednesday, yesterday, and today, taking your questions on this. The White House counsel has put out a very extensive, multiple statements on this as well. And you all, I know, you all have been talking, many of you here have been talking to my colleague in the White House counsel. So what the actions that we took were right actions that his team took in dealing with the Department of Justice and also the archives. Look,
you guys have answered questions when the press has broken in the news.
Because it's an ongoing process. Because, again, it is an ongoing process. There is a process here. The Department of Justice is independent. We respect that process. But again, I have taken questions. I can take two questions to 100 questions. I have answered your questions as almost every day on this issue. And again, anything else that you may have, anything that's related to the review, I would refer you to the Department of Justice.
One last question, because I know you've got to move on here. But the president campaigned on the argument that he would restore confidence. We know that he's in the process of deciding whether to officially announce he's running for re-election. Does this episode undercut that argument, that he would restore confidence? Because here we have in the headlines that he is now under investigation.
He's restored independence in the Department of Justice. That's what we're doing here. When we're saying we're going to refer you to the Department of Justice, that is restoring independence as it relates to issues like this. And that is important to the president. And it's been consistent. What I am saying about investigations has been consistent for the last 2 years. You've heard me over and over. Again, when it comes to a legal issue or a matter like this, we have always referred to the Department of Justice. So there's nothing here, different here. We have said we wanted to restore the independence of the Department of Justice. That is what you're seeing. And again, this has been done in a transparent way. When it relates to how this was dealt with the Department of Justice and the archives. The President takes this very, very seriously. Any other questions that you may have about this particular issue, about the review, I would refer you to the Department of Justice. You guys have been in touch with my colleagues at the White House Counsel Office, and I would suggest that you continue to reach out. Go ahead, Stephen.
Thanks. I just want to press you on that point about the idea of disclosures when it's appropriate. You describe a process, but it sort of feels like a strategy. A communication strategy to protect the president from political damage. Was it the hope and expectation here that this would have remained a private matter and not have been subject to public disclosure?
Look, Stephen, that's your version of the case. I've been very clear here, and I've answered that question multiple times in different versions, right, in the last couple of days. Look, want to be very clear. There is a process here. We are going to respect the process. This is all part of the Department of Justice process, and we are cooperating fully. We are cooperating fully in this process. And again, the President believes that the Justice Department and its independence needed to be restored. That's what you have seen under this administration the last 2 years, and I want to be consistent in what I'm saying. I want to be prudent in what I'm saying when I say that we are going to defer any questions related to this to the Department of Justice and any other items that you have. If you don't want to talk to the Department of Justice, you're free to talk to the White House Counsel Office. I know you guys have been in touch with my colleagues there.
We have done both, but let me just ask you, because oftentimes in the careers of White House press secretaries, there comes a time where they are asked, what they knew and when they knew it. Were you or any member of your staff involved in the crafting of a strategy as to when this disclosure should be made in advance of CBS News breaking the story on Monday evening?
No. Go ahead. Oh, did you have a question?
I did. Driving down the answer there. A couple of eco questions for you. Do you have a position on how high the debt limit should be raised?
I don't have a position on that. What I can say more broadly, what I'm saying is that more broadly speaking, not going to get into the specifics of that. What I can say is that we believe when it comes to the debt limit, it has been done in a bipartisan way over the years and decades, and it should be done in a bipartisan way, and it should be done without conditions. That is important here. And so we're going to continue to encourage and ask Congress to take action, and that's where we're going to leave it at this time. We're not going to do any negotiations, and it should be, again, done without conditions.
Calls to Congress and all? Is this a Ledger Affairs thing, or is it entirely up to Congress?
I've said that our Office of Ledger Affairs has been in touch with the new Congress to make sure that they know who to reach out, the appropriate people to reach out on the Office of Ledger Affairs. And so we're going to continue. We're always having conversations with members of Congress. The President always has multiple conversations with members of Congress. As you know, he has a lot of longtime friends who are over on the other side of Pennsylvania. And so that is something that continues. But when it comes to this, when it comes to the debt limit, it should be done without conditions. It was done under the last president 3 times in a bipartisan way, and so this should continue.
And very quickly on the CPI data yesterday, pretty good result there. That comes on the heels of the jobs data, which was pretty strong. Your officials have been kind of jazzed about that, it seems, on TV in the last 24 hours or so. Is it fair to say that the White House is thinking this is what a soft landing could look like, or are you not getting that far?
What we can say. Team soft landing. I'll say this, and as you said, you've heard from many of my colleagues who are who are economists who have been working on this issue, pushing for the president's economic plan. Look, it just goes back to the president's economic plan, and we see it as it's working, right? With what the vision that the president has for this country. When you think about when he came in, he passed the American Rescue Plan. You think about all the other historic pieces of legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation. I talked multiple times in at the top about the Inflation Reduction Act. Look, it matters what the vision of a president is and him acting out on it. And that's what you saw. When you see inflation down for 6 months, that matters, right? That's because of the president's economic plan. When you see annual inflation down 6.5% from where it was this summer, just this summer at 9.1%, gas prices down by about more than $1.70 from its peak. All of that matters. And so that's how we're seeing this. We're seeing it as the president's economic plan is indeed working. We are going to continue to put the American families and American people first and work on this issue that you hear us talk about all the time. His number one economic issue is bringing down inflation. That's why the Inflation Reduction Act, what I talked about, when you think about healthcare, when you think about Medicare and negotiating those prices, when you think about what we announced in Georgia, 2,500 jobs are going to be created because of the Inflation Reduction Act, all of that matters, and all of that is important, and it's more broadly speaking about the president's economic plan. Look, we believe that we continue to be in this transition of stable and steady growth, and I think that's what we believe. That's what the numbers continue to show as you talk about the jobs report that we saw recently, and as we talk about the CPI data.
You're not calling it a soft landing.
I'm just saying that we are in this transition of a transition to stable and steady growth, and we believe that the president's economic policies that he's put forward in the past 2 years, we see that working. Go ahead, Franco.
Thanks. U.S. Attorney John Losh was looking into this for several weeks before. He was in touch with...
Looking into what exactly?
The classified documents. Okay. He was in touch with President Biden's counsel. I wanted to know, was President Biden, was the White House surprised that along with Merrick Garland that they decided that more investigation was needed and a special counsel was appointed?
What I can tell you is that we were not given a heads up that Attorney General Garland was going to made his announcement yesterday on the special counsel. That is something that we learned, like many of you, watching the news. I'm not going to get into anything further from that. I can't speak to this person who you just mentioned who has been, I don't know, having conversations or making comments about this. I'm just not going to get into that. I'm not going to give reactions from here. What I can tell you is that, again, I'm going to refer you to the White House counsel and office to talk to my colleagues on any particular questions that you may have that's related to this process. And if it's something that you want to know specifically about the review, I will refer you to the Department of Justice.
When President Biden did say, God willing, he hoped to be able to say more soon. I mean, it seemed like he was thinking that the investigation would end soon. I mean, was he surprised?
I'm just not going to go beyond what the president said. I will say this is that we are going to continue to fully cooperate. As I've said, we have talked about this at length. We've had multiple statements on this, and again, we want to be prudent here. I'm going to be consistent here. Any questions that you may have about this process, I would refer you to the White House counsel.
Another topic. I wanted to ask about the administration's appeal of the Sutherland Springs mass shooting case. Does it concern the administration that some gun control advocates are concerned or worried about the appeal by the DOJ and that appeal undercuts Biden's own stance on background checks, and actually also that the NRA is essentially applauding the DOJ's move?
So look, when it comes to issues like this, legal issues, that is something that the Department of Justice deals with. Again, they are independent, so I would refer you to them on their decision. The president continues to be committed on making sure that we address an issue that is affecting families across the country, communities across the country, which is gun violence. That's why it was so critical when he signed the bipartisan piece of legislation on gun violence just a couple of months ago, this past summer. And he's going to continue to call for the ban of assault weapons, working with Congress to make that happen. And let's not forget, the first year and a half of this administration, we put forward more executive actions than any other president on dealing with this issue, on dealing with protecting our communities, protecting families, dealing with gun violence, and that is that call that he has, especially the call to action from Congress, is going to continue and it's not going to stop. going to go to the back. Go ahead.
I have two questions on the meeting with the Prime Minister, but just briefly on the documents. We have seen online propaganda from adversaries seeking to take advantage from this revelation.
I'm sorry, can you go back a little bit? Who's seeking to take advantage?
We have seen online propaganda from adversaries seeking to take advantage of the revelation of the classified documents. I wonder if you can share with us whether the administration is anticipating any kind of national security implications from this fallout. Are you hearing any kind of intelligence, and are you doing anything to deter those threats?
Again, I'm just not going to talk about any intelligence from here. I would certainly, anything that's related to this, I would refer you to the Department of Justice and also refer you to my colleagues at the White House Counsel. I'm just not going to go into anything, especially national security affairs, and so I would refer you to them.
I'd probably follow up with your National
That'd be
Security
great.
Council first. Okay,
That'd be great.
On the meeting, I know we're waiting for a readout, but if you can tell us whether the leaders spoke about semiconductors and whether Japan confirmed that it will enact export controls to limit Chinese access to semiconductors, and whether the Prime Minister again urged President Biden, as he has done so many times, if he would be open to joining CPTPP.
So on CPTPP, this is not an option we're exploring. I think we've said that before. We're focused on the IPEF, as you know, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, negotiations and deepening our economic ties with those 13 partners, many of which are TPP partners. So that is going to be our focus. That has not changed. As it relates, again, I don't want to get ahead of the conversation. They're currently still having a dialogue. The bilat is still occurring, but I expect they will discuss China, Russia's war against Ukraine, and the DPRK's unlawful nuclear and missile programs, and the leaders will focus on what they can get done together in 2023. Japan holds in the G7 presidency and has just taken a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council, while we're hosting the APEC and seeking to make shift progress on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Prime Minister Kishida arrived at the White House, as you all know. I believe my colleague laid out what came out of that 2+2 after consulting closely with us and regional partners in Europe, and I expect the President and the Prime Minister Kishida will debrief on those consultations. Again, don't want to get ahead of, we're going to have a readout for you. They're having this conversation currently, and so once we have the readout this afternoon, we certainly will share that.
If I can just dig a little bit deeper on IPEF, Karine, because we really haven't heard much about this framework since it was launched last year. So at this point, it seems like the administration still believes that this is the best offer that the U.S. can give to counter Chinese trade clout. Am I understanding this correctly?
Let me so as you said, it was announced in Tokyo just this past May, and Japan was a critical partner, as you know, in helping us to build support, particularly among Southeast Asian countries. So that is important. Again, Japan has been a critical partner in this. IPEF partners represent 40% of the world GDP, and we are united in our belief that much of our success in coming decades will depend on how well governments harness innovation. So that is part of it, right? We got to see how this works through, especially the transformations afoot in the clean energy, digital technology sectors, while fortifying our economies against a range of threats, from fragile supply chains to corruption to tax havens. So again, with Japan's partnerships and leadership in the negotiations, we expect to achieve high standard commitments that will deepen our economic engagement in the region and make good progress in text-based negotiations this year. So this is a partnership that is incredibly important. Japan played a very big role in it. When you think about it represents the 40% of the world GDP. And so, look, this is, again, an important partnership. This is a framework that we are incredibly committed to, and we appreciate Japan's partnership in this. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, thanks, Karine. I want to ask you about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce embraced President Biden in 2020, and now the president of the U.S. Chamber says The businesses it represents are fed up with the government making it harder to do business and adding new rules and regulations. Do you have any response?
Yes, I do. First thing, the president's first 2 years in office have been the best for job creation in history when you think about nearly 10.5 million jobs created. Manufacturing and small businesses are on the rise, and we are seeing progress in our fight against global inflation. So that's the first piece to just lay out there. The second, look, I don't think that it's all of the chamber's presidents who said that. She also called out polarization and gridlock and called for permitting reform, immigration reform, improving child care, improving climate resilience, and funding law enforcement. So those are all areas where President has called for Congress to act. And we also agree with the chamber that Congress must address the debt limit, and we can, quote, not play chicken with the true faith and credit of the United States. That's end quote. And lastly, let me just say, as I think everyone is aware, the last 2 years showed historic bipartisan progress for the American people. I've talked about during this press briefing those pieces of legislation, again, historic pieces of legislation, including on rebuilding our infrastructure and investing in American manufacturing. So the president's plans on infrastructure, next generation research, clean energy, and manufacturing are strongly supported by business community. Again, we do outreach to different communities when we talk about these important pieces of legislation, when we talk about the president's economic plan, but he also believes big corporations should pay their fair share in taxes. And that's not just us. That's also the American public who believes that they should be doing this.
Well, she said also that there's government regulatory overreach, adding, and I'll quote her, when regulations are driven by ideological agendas and imposed on businesses without transparency, accountability, or clarity, government isn't working. So will there be changes, and is government working?
Look, I'll say this. Our administration is leveraging every available tool to advance the president's ambitious agenda for the country and to deliver for the American people. That's the president's primary goal. When he came into the administration, and it continues to be the case, he wanted to make sure that he's delivering for the American people, delivering for American families, making sure that we're building an economy from the bottom up, middle out, and that's what you are seeing. I was just asked about the inflation data, the CPI data, and the jobs report. We are seeing, while there's still more work to do, we are seeing the president's economic policy is actually working. Okay. Go ahead, Alex, in the back.
Yeah, Karine, earlier this week we discussed the situation in Florida with, I think, about 350 Cuban migrants landing at Dry Tortuga and Key West. I believe you said it was a political ploy on the part of Governor DeSantis to deploy the National Guard. His office has said that the Coast Guard requested help patrolling the waters off Florida. So can you just kind of discuss your understanding of the situation in Florida and how that understanding has developed in the last several days?
And I'm happy to repeat what I said, which is Governor DeSantis has made a mockery of the system, and he has consistently and constantly, as many of you have reported, has done political stunts, has not helped to address the issue, but has instead decided to put the lives of migrants who are coming here for a better life at risk, and that's what we have seen from this governor. Look, when it comes to the Coast Guard and Customs and Border Protection, they are deploying additional personnel and resources to Florida to quickly process individuals and place them in removal proceedings. I would note that the migrants from Cuba who arrived in Florida over a week ago were processed and moved out of the state by Border Patrol within days. At the national park that you mentioned, it reopened just this past Sunday. The president has expanded safe, orderly, legal pathways for migration, including for Cubans, and we continue to urge individuals to use those instead of risking their lives at the hands of human strugglers. And you heard that directly from this president just a couple of days ago on the world stage in Mexico City. I'm going to try and call folks I haven't. Go ahead, Karen. Folks I haven't called on. I called earlier. Go ahead, Karen.
You've several times today referred people to the White House counsel for questions about the process and the review. Would you bring Richard Sauber here or someone from his team to answer these questions in the briefing room in a formal capacity?
So look, the White House counsel's office has provided information on this this week as appropriate. Again, I think I just said this, I've said this multiple times during this briefing, that I know in the last 24 hours, my colleagues at the White House Council White House Council Office has been in touch with many of you and has answered a lot of your questions. And so that will continue. You reach out to them and they will certainly engage. And so I'm going to leave it there. But again, anything that is related to this review, I would send you to Department of Justice. Again, if there is something specific to this that you want from us, I would refer you to the White House Counsel Office.
And is the White House concerned that this investigation is going to overshadow what you are trying to do right now, what your message is right now?
Look, our message is very clear, and it will continue to be just that. And you've seen it. That's why when I started the briefing, I laid out all of the kind of progress that we have made just this week alone. When you think about the Inflation Reduction Act, when you think about how it's going to lower costs for American families, when you think about the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, just recently, as some of you were there in Kentucky, where you saw bipartisanship talking about a bridge that has, for decades, presidents have talked about fixing that bridge. And this president, because of the bipartisanship that he was able to bring together, got that done. And so, look, we're not going to stop talking about how we're going to deliver for the American people. I actually think, and we actually believe, there are people who are watching, the American people who are watching want to hear that. They want to hear what I just laid out at the beginning of the briefing. They want to know how this president, how this administration, how the federal government is delivering for them. So we're going to continue to have those conversations. You're going to continue to hear from me speaking about that. You heard from the president yesterday talking about the CPI data and how important it was to see inflation go down in six months, and how we're seeing record low unemployment in 50 years. That is conversation, and that work is going to continue. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend. Hi. I know, I bring bearing gifts. I have some Thanksgiving cookies for all of you. Happy holidays. You guys have to pass this around.
Are these from the White House, or did you make them yourself?
Sure. It would be quite impressive, wouldn't it be? Oh, I know. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm joined by White House COVID Coordinator Dr. Ashish Jha and Chief Medical Advisor to the President and NIAID Director Dr. Fauci. As you all know, Dr. Fauci is retiring next month, And I'm honored, so honored, to have him join me today. One more time at the podium, and he's going to discuss the importance of getting your updated COVID vaccine shot ahead of the holidays. For so many Americans throughout our fight with COVID, Dr. Fauci has been a source of information and facts. But Dr. Fauci's leadership and legacy stretch far beyond the past couple of years, as you all have known him. It actually goes back even further, as I was just stating, whether it be HIV/AIDS, Ebola, or COVID-19. For close to 4 decades and under 7 Republican and Democratic presidents, Dr. Fauci has always led with the science, and our country is stronger and healthier because of his leadership. Today, he's returned again to tell you a bit more about the science related to this updated COVID shots that you've heard us all talk about, and an important, clear message you've heard from him before, which is please get vaccinated, get your vaccine. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. Fauci for his last run at the podium. It's all yours, Dr. Fauci.
Thank you very much, Karine, for that really very, very kind introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be back here with you again, albeit, I believe, for the last time. But as Karine said, I'm going to spend the next just couple of minutes talking to you about the importance of getting an updated booster vaccine as we enter into the holiday season and the colder weeks and months of the late fall and early winter. So let's just talk very briefly about what we know about the vaccines, because we want to make our decisions really based on facts, evidence, and data. Are the vaccines safe? That keeps coming up. The answer is now overwhelmingly it should be off the table. There have been 13 billion doses of a COVID-19 vaccine that have been distributed worldwide, hundreds of millions in the United States, and there's robust safety monitoring systems that are in place, and clearly an extensive body of information clearly indicates that they're safe. Next, are they effective? And I believe you are all aware of this. If you look at the striking data, overwhelmingly show the effectiveness of vaccines, particularly in preventing severe illness and deaths. And recent data that has come out indicate that if, in fact, you are vaccinated and boosted compared to an unvaccinated person, there's a 14 times lower risk of dying in the most recent BA.4/5 era compared to unvaccinated, and at least a 3 times lower risk of testing positive compared to the unvaccinated individuals. But then there's some issues that we have to deal with that are sometimes confusing to the American public. If that's such great data, why do you tell us that we should be, for our own safety and that of our families and the community, get a booster shot? There are 2 issues that in some respects are unprecedented when it comes to infectious diseases. And that is, as good as the vaccine is, and as good as post-infection protection is, the immunity and protection wanes over time. Let me put it into some perspective for you. If you get vaccinated with measles or infected with measles, the duration of protection is measured at a minimum in decades and likely for a lifetime. That just happens to, unfortunately, not be the case when you're dealing with coronavirus and particularly SARS-CoV-2. So you need to update the protection that we know is good protection. Next, we have the complicating issue that we can't do anything about, is that you have the emergence every several months now, historically, of variants. Remember, Delta, Omicron, BA.4/5, BQ 1.1, the things that we're all hearing about and reading about and seeing. You don't have that with another example, just getting back to measles, which we're all familiar with. There are no variants of measles. I got infected with measles when I was a youngster because I'm old enough to not be getting the vaccine. And that measles is the same measles that's circulating now in the developing world. It doesn't change. And that's the 2 major reasons for getting a booster. The booster's bivalent. People get confused with that word. What does bivalent means? There's two components. One is the ancestral original vaccine that we all got, and the other is the updated BA.4/5. So then people ask appropriate questions. Do they really work? What are the parameters to see if they work? There are two parameters. One is what the vaccine does in boosting an immune response. We refer to that in the medical circles as immune correlates. And then there's the real-world vaccine efficacy. If you look at the recent data that has now been coming out from the companies as well as academic investigators, it is clear now, despite initial bit of confusion, that the BA.4/5 bivalent booster, what we refer to as the updated vaccine, clearly induces a better response against BA.4/5 and the sublineages of BA.4/5 than does the ancestral strain. So from a pure immunological standpoint, it looks quite good. Clinical efficacy data from the CDC will be released. In fact, it already has been released. It was supposed to be released at 11:30, which is clinical efficacy data, looking at real-world data of hundreds of thousands of people, looking at the capability of the virus to protect against the real-world BA.4/5 that has been circulating. And we know that that is really quite good. So you have immunological data, and you have now clinical efficacy data. Everybody was asking the question, where's the clinical efficacy data? Now it has come out with the CDC MMWR this morning. So we know it's safe. We know that it is effective. So my message, and my final message, maybe the final message I give you from this podium, is that please, for your own safety, for that of your family, get your updated COVID-19 shot as soon as you're eligible to protect yourself, your family, and your community. I urge you to visit vaccines.gov to find a location where you can easily get an updated vaccine. And please do it as soon as possible. Thank you.
Well, hard to follow Dr. Fauci, who I would argue has been the most important, consequential public servant in the United States in the last half century, and a leader and a role model for so many of us. So, Tony, thank you. So thank you for reviewing the safety and effectiveness data. I will tell you, it is remarkable to me what data have come in the last month. I was here in front of all of you a couple of months ago talking about what we expected. All of the evidence that has come in the last month has far exceeded our expectations on the efficacy of these vaccines. And the safety data continues to be terrific. Today I want to focus on a new 6-week sprint that the administration is announcing to get more Americans their updated shots before the cold and winter season really settles in. Now, I want to start off by saying we are heartened to say that we are not alone in this effort. Just yesterday, 12 of America's leading medical and clinical societies, I'm talking about the AMA, I'm talking about American College of Physicians, the American Association of Family Physicians, I'm not going to list them all 12, but they all joined together with one simple, strong recommendation for all Americans, which is go get your updated COVID vaccine shot and go get your annual flu shot right away. Now, why did they do that? Why did America's physicians, speaking as a unified voice, say that? Because they know the best way to save lives this holiday season is to ensure that all Americans, particularly seniors, get their updated COVID vaccine and their flu vaccine. Now, we've already had 35 million Americans have gotten their updated COVID vaccine, including 16 million seniors. And we are encouraged by steady and strong week-by-week numbers. We're seeing about 4 to 5 million Americans getting it every week. But we are working hard to reach even more Americans, especially older, more vulnerable Americans. So as I said, today we're launching a 6-week sprint to help Americans get their updated shot by the end of the year. As part of this effort, with our limited resources that we have, we are making a series of announcements and a series of efforts to expand community-based COVID-19 vaccine efforts. So let me lay out some of them. We're announcing $350 million in funding to help community health centers meet people where they are, with facts, with vaccines, through proven methods like partnerships with faith-based groups and mobile vaccine clinics. We're announcing an additional $125 million to help local aging and disability networks to get older and more vulnerable and disabled Americans vaccinated. This will include efforts at senior centers across our great country. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, is going to be issuing guidance today, reminding nursing homes that they are required to educate their residents on the benefits of COVID-19 vaccines, and they are required to offer vaccines to residents. And nursing homes that don't do these very basic things will be referred for greater oversight and possibly face enforcement actions. We're doubling down on our trusted messengers work because we know that makes a difference. We're working with national and local organizations, state and public health departments, pharmacies. You're going to hear schools and colleges and universities announce that they're hosting clinics. All of this, we think, is going to make a difference. Also, what will make a difference is more paid media efforts by the Department of Health and Human Services, designed to reach tens of millions of Americans, for instance, that are watching the World Cup through television and through digital ads. Bottom line is that we're doing everything we can in the next 6 weeks to help families get their updated COVID shots by the end of the year, because it's the best protection for this winter. And remember, for a majority of Americans, this is going to be a once-a-year shot. One COVID shot once a year, just like the flu shot. Now, while I'm encouraged by the work that so many are doing, we need everybody to step up. We need to make protecting our loved ones an important part of the conversation we have around the Thanksgiving table, an important part of the conversation we have in the days and weeks ahead. Because here's what we know. If folks get their updated vaccines and they get treated if they have a breakthrough infection, we can prevent essentially every COVID death in America. That is a remarkable fact 2.5 years after we found this virus first in our country. But it's going to take all of us to make that happen. So please, don't wait. Get your COVID shot. Get your flu shot. That's why God gave you 2 arms. You get one in each arm if you want. Go to vaccines.gov, and let's do everything we all can to protect the American people. Thank you.
Okay, take a couple questions. Go ahead, Steve.
Dr. Jean, why is a 6-week, why is this necessary? Are the numbers lagging?
No, look, we've had very consistent, as I said, about 4 to 5 million shots going in. There are a couple of things that, we are obviously now entering a higher risk part of the year. Why? Because each of the last 2 years, we've seen a substantial increase in cases as we got into December and January. So this is a really important moment to announce this effort. We think that if people do this now and do this over the next couple of weeks, it's going to protect them over the holiday. So we think this is exactly the right time to make this. And the administration is obviously deeply committed to making sure we're doing everything we can to protect the American people.
For Dr. Fauci, I have 2 questions if I can. Hospitalizations for the flu at this point in the season are the highest in over a decade. Why is the flu so bad this year, and how much protection is the flu vaccine providing for those who have gotten it?
Yeah, well, let me answer the second question first, is that the vaccine is well matched to the circulating strain. So that, again, is another really good reason to tell people what Dr. Jar and I and others have been saying about get your flu vaccine, because that's one of the issues that we're going to be dealing with this winter that we can do something about. When you have seasons of very low flu, which got kind of bumped off the table by COVID, when you have respiratory illnesses that circulate, they sort of have niches that you very rarely have one and the other at its peak. So when we were at a peak with COVID, all the other respiratory illnesses, including RSV and including flu, were very, very low compared to other years. When you now open up in society, people now maybe are under-vaccinated. Not everybody's wearing a mask. We're trying to get back and are getting back to some degree of normality. You almost have like a rebound effect of something that was very low for 2 seasons. If you look at the flu over the last couple of years, in the peak of the COVID back in 2020 and 2021, we were having the lowest flu seasons on record. So it's not surprising that we're seeing it return back.
And if you don't, one more if you don't
Sure.
mind. This is your last appearance at the podium. You became a household name in large part because of your appearances here at the early stages of COVID. What do you want Americans to remember about your service in government?
Well, I think what I've accomplished in my 54 years at the NIH and my 38 years as the director of NIAID, although COVID is really, really very important, it is a fragment of the total 40 years that I've been doing it. So I'll let other people judge the value or not of my accomplishments. But what I would like people to remember about what I've done is that every day for all of those years, I've given it everything that I have, and I've never left anything on the field. So if they want to remember me, whether they judge rightly or wrongly what I've done, I gave it all I got for many decades.
I'm hoping I can ask quickly about also the XBB variant that's rising from India and Singapore. What should Americans expect as that variant continues to rise? And just to take a step back, I know you were encouraging folks here to get their latest booster, but should Americans expect what we've been seeing in terms of more cases, not as many hospitalizations? Just a step back, what should Americans expect when it comes to COVID?
Well, what Americans should expect is from our experience that you never can definitively say what to expect, but you should really take some comfort in knowing that we'd have within our wherewithal to mitigate anything that comes our way. Because we have flu vaccines, we have COVID vaccines, we have testing, we have the option under certain circumstances with good judgment to wear masks where appropriate in indoor congregate settings. So we can do a lot to mitigate any surge. One thing we're encouraged with looking at other countries, such as Singapore, which had a big XBB, they had increase in cases, but they did not have a concomitant major increase in hospitalizations. So we're hoping that a combination of people who've been infected and boosted and vaccinated, or people who've been vaccinated and boosted and not infected, that there's enough community protection that we're not going to see a repeat of what we saw last year at this time.
Is the latest booster effective against XBB?
Yeah. The XBB is one that evades immune response as measured by antibody, which is one of the elements, not the only element of protection. Much more of cellular T-cell responses protect you against severe disease. The protection is diminished multifold with XBB. If you look at the best, and then it goes down a bit with one, it goes down with BQ 1.1, it goes down even more with XBB. It doesn't fall off the map, but it goes down. So you could expect some protection, but not the optimal protection.
Got April, and then Alex in the back.
Dr. Fauci and Dr. Josh. Dr. Fauci first, and Dr. Josh first on the issue of COVID and mask wearing. We're not talking about mask wearing in this moment. Masks and the word masks have become a pejorative in some parts of this nation. Can you talk about the importance of mask wearing as you're worried about the holidays and people gathering together? And then on the gatherings for Thanksgiving and Christmas, what do you recommend for families who may have some who boosted and may have some who are not boosted, may have some who have not had a vaccine at all?
Well, I think your first and second question are related, because what it really tells you is that we have multiple interventions and multiple actions we can take to protect ourselves. So there's a whole spectrum. Masking is one of them. Now, we're not talking about requirements or mandating. We're talking about if you're in a situation and each individual person evaluates their own risk and that of the risk of their family members, for example, like a person who's 25-year-old living alone versus someone who has an elderly parent or grandparent or someone who's immune compromised. First of all, everybody should be vaccinated and boosted with flu and with COVID. Whether or not you wear a mask, or another thing we shouldn't underestimate is testing. So when we're gathering at a family gathering for Thanksgiving or for Christmas or for any other holiday as we get into the winter, it makes sense that you might want to get a test that day before you come into a place in which you might be infected and spread it, or other people who might be there, in order to protect. So masking is important, but you can count masking, vaccine, boosting, testing. All of that is part of the spectrum of protecting yourself and your family.
But what do you say about the word mask now being a pejorative in some communities?
No, it shouldn't be. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I know sometimes when you walk in and you have a mask and nobody has a mask, you kind of feel guilty you shouldn't feel guilty. You look terrific. Right.
I have no problem in here wearing a mask, thank you.
All right, we gotta move on. Go ahead, Alex. Go ahead. Alex, don't be disrespectful. You're being disrespectful. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Hold on, no, wait, I did not call on you, Stephen. Go ahead, Alex, you're next.
Karine, my first question is, last year, two questions. The first is, last year we were really kind of hoping that the holiday season would go well, sort of look normal, and then Omicron came along and sort of disrupted a large chunk of January, February schools, flights. Are we seeing a similar dynamic, especially with some of these new subvariants coming along? And then my second question, Dr. Fauci, for you specifically, what was the most difficult moment of the pandemic response for you throughout the last, two and a half years?
I'll start with the first, and then obviously Dr. Fauci can answer the second. So the short answer is no. First of all, you can't predict with any certainty. So we don't know what Mother Nature is going to throw at us. That said, these subvariants, obviously we're tracking them very closely. The good news is, even if you see a diminishing of our vaccines, they're still effective against these subvariants, way more effective than the original vaccine, right? So I feel very confident that if people continue to get vaccinated at good numbers, if people get boosted, we can absolutely have a very safe and healthy holiday season. Well, there's always a caveat here of things out of the left field you can't predict and you can't, but nothing I have seen in the subvariants makes me believe that we can't manage our way through it effectively, especially if people step up and get their vaccine.
So that's a really difficult question to answer, but the most difficult because, we've all lived through almost 3 years of the most horrendous outbreak that we've experienced as a society in well over 100 years. But there are certain things that stand out. I mean, I could probably write an essay on all the things that were difficult time. But one of the things, as a physician whose goal in life is to care for patients and to prevent and treat illness and ameliorate suffering, is that I remember back in my days in medical school and when I was an intern and a resident, when a patient came in, whether or not the patient didn't like you, was angry with you, whether it was a rich person or a poor person, you treated everybody the same because you cared about them and you wanted everyone to walk out healthy. So when I see people in this country, because of the divisiveness in our country, of not getting vaccinated for reasons that have nothing to do with public health, but have to do because of divisiveness and ideological differences, as a physician, it pains me because I don't want to see anybody get infected. I don't want to see anybody hospitalized, and I don't want to see anybody die from COVID. Whether you're a far-right Republican or a far-left Democrat, it doesn't make any difference to me. I look upon it the same way as I did in the emergency room in the middle of New York City when I was taking care of everybody that was coming in off the street. So that's the thing that troubles me most about this.
Dr. Fauci, only 13% of...
Hold on one second. We have a process here. I'm not calling out on people who yell. And you're being disrespectful to your colleagues and you're being disrespectful to our guests. I will not call on you if you yell. And also you're taking time off the clock because Dr. Fauci has to leave in a couple of minutes. I'm done. I'm not getting into a back and forth with you. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Dr. Fauci,
but she's
only
asking
only
a great question.
You're not being disrespectful. Go ahead, Jeremy.
You ask your question, you should allow her to ask some question.
Jeremy,
She's asking a valid
Jeremy,
question, Dr. Fauci,
it's
on the origin of COVID-19.
It is not your turn. It is not your turn.
You come on the same people. That's the thing. You can't read a press briefing. You need to call from people across the room. She has a valid question. She's asking about the origin of COVID-19.
I hear the question.
And Dr. Fauci is the best person to answer
I hear your question, but we're not doing this the way you want it. This is a disrespectful. It is. I'm done. Simon, I'm done. Simon, I'm done. I'm done with you right now. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. You're taking time away from your colleagues. Go ahead.
Only 13% of adults have gotten this updated bivalent booster. 78% of adults have completed their primary series. Which of those numbers is more important in your mind in terms of anticipating how bad this winter surge could be if there is one, and the number of hospitalizations and deaths? And then a second question for you as well.
Yeah, Jeremy, they're both important, so I don't want to say one is more and then diminish the other. But the people who are most at risk are the unvaccinated. I mean, we have 68% of our population is vaccinated. You know, that means that we have 32% of the population that's not. And if you look at the data, they are just profoundly striking of the curves of death and hospitalization of unvaccinated versus vaccinated and boosted. So there is a relatively smaller difference in vaccinated and unboosted versus vaccinated plus boosted. That doesn't mean you shouldn't get boosted, but the real danger is in the people who have not been vaccinated. So that's where we expect, if we're going to see a problem this winter, it's going to be among those people.
And then as you reflect on the end of your time and decades in government service, and particularly your handling of the pandemic, did you imagine that this virus would still, as we are here today, be killing 200 to 300 people a day?
No.
Did you imagine, the level of cases, and what is your outlook for the future of this virus as you look in the next several years?
No, I did not imagine that. I don't think any of my colleagues imagined that we would see a 3-year saga of suffering and death and 1 million Americans losing their lives. The thing that was most disturbing is something I referred to an answer to one of the other questions, was the continuation of multiple variants evolving over time, completely unlike something like measles. And that's the reason why I gave the measles comparison. Where I think we're going is that sooner or later, and I hope it's sooner, we're going to equilibrate to a low level when there's enough background cross protection that unless we get a completely far way out different variant, we're likely going to see a continued lowering and lowering. Maybe we're going to see blips at winter and stuff, but hopefully it gets down. The message that Dr. Jarrah and I are trying to get to you today is that we can make that happen much sooner by vaccinating and by keeping updating on your booster. It's just really as simple as that. We're going to get there. We can get there with less suffering if we use the interventions that we have. If you want to let nature take its course, we're ultimately going to get there, but we're going to lose a lot more people than we need to.
Can I just add one more quick thing to that? I mean, look, there are hundreds of thousands of Americans who have died this year because people were under-vaccinated, people did not get people weren't boosted. And it is not blaming the people who died, it is blaming the fact we still have a lot of people out there spreading misinformation, undermining people's confidence in vaccines. There was a paper out last week that showed that death numbers in many European countries were much lower because their booster rates are much higher. So the key point here is, at this point, we can prevent nearly every death in America from COVID. But we can't see this as like a horse race of let's get an anti-vaxxer and let's get we know what the evidence is. The science on this is crystal clear. People get their booster. If you get infected, the chances you're going to end up super sick in the hospital is exceedingly low. That's the message. People need to get their updated vaccine.
In the back for Dr. Fauci, last question. Go ahead.
Me? Yeah. Sorry, thank you so much. Dr. Fauci, if I could just ask you to reflect on the early days of this pandemic and the mixed messages that were coming out of this White House, and how that affected people's trust, and how you're going to take that message forward in future pandemics, and the importance of trust, and how you would advise Dr. Jha and his colleagues to emphasize that in future pandemics.
Well, there was really a difference early on in the first weeks to months of the outbreak, because we were dealing with truly a moving target. And when you're dealing with things like reporting and discussing with the press, making recommendations, making guidelines, you have to make it on the basis of the information that you have at that time. But what's happening is that we were not dealing with a static situation. We were dealing with a dynamic situation. First, we thought it was just animal to human, didn't spread well from human to human. Then we found that it spread very well. And then we found out that it spread enormously well. Then we found out that it was aerosolized. Then we found out that 50 to 60% of the people who transmit it don't have any symptoms at all. So the recommendations that were based on what you knew in January, when you get to March, April, and May, they will change. Understandably, that leads to a question on the part of the public is why they keep changing things. You know, a simple comparison and analogy, in January, 2 + 2 = 4. In April, May, August, September, 2 + 2 still equals 4. When you're dealing with an evolving outbreak where the information you get changes from week to week and month to month, we've got to probably do a better job of when we talk to the public, explain that this is a dynamic situation that could change. I've said that from this podium multiple times when we were talking about, for example, do we need to do anything different now when we had 15 cases? I said, but, however, semicolon, this could change. The only thing people heard when they throw it back at you, well, you said we don't have to worry about anything. So you just got to make sure you always underscore the dynamic nature of what you're dealing with.
I'm sorry to contradict you, but there was some dubious advice coming out of the
Excuse me?
There was some dubious advice, some questionable medical advice coming out of non-doctors
Right.
at this podium. How do you think that affected the progress of this
Well,
pandemic?
you remember, if you were around, that at this podium, I contradicted those, which set off a whole series of things in my life. You know, yeah, I mean, we have to continue, and we were just talking about this a little while ago. The way you counter misinformation and disinformation is that to do whatever you can, as often as you can, to provide correct information. The people who have correct information, who take science seriously, who don't have strange way out theories about things, but who base what they say on evidence and data, need to speak up more, because the other side that just keeps putting out misinformation and disinformation seems to be tireless in that effort, and it's going to be very difficult.
All right, thank you, Dr.
How are you
Fauci.
preparing
Thank you.
for the likely
Thank you.
aggressive oversight from House Republicans, the new majority next year that they've been
So,
promising on some
hold
of
on
these
one
very
second. Dr. Jha is going to stay to take a couple more questions, but Dr. Fauci actually has to go. So thank you so much, Dr. Fauci.
Thank you. Yeah, I can answer his
You want
question.
to answer it?
Yeah.
Okay, he says he'll
See,
answer it.
I'm
Okay,
a
go
good-
ahead. Go ahead. I'm just trying to keep him
all
on
right.
time.
The answer is, if there are oversight hearings, I absolutely will cooperate fully and testify before the Congress if asked. You may not know, but I've testified before the Congress a few hundred times, okay, over the last 40 years or so. So I have no trouble testifying. We can defend and explain and stand by everything that we've said. So I have nothing to hide.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Dr. Fauci. How much do you think, Dr. Fauci, how much, just a follow-up on the oversight, Dr. Fauci.
All right, thank you, Dr. Fauci.
Time for a couple of questions.
We'll take a couple, Dr. Jha.
Yeah, you can pick up, and then we'll try and get some more around the
The administration has requested $10 billion in this lame duck session for the urgent COVID needs that still remain. That's less than half of what you had even requested during the summer.
Yep.
Is that sufficient in your mind to meet these needs, not just to deal with COVID, but the strains on the hospital system we're seeing from flu, from RSV, and at a time when you're making these kinds of urgent requests and warnings, is it undercut at all by some of the rhetoric we've been hearing, even from the president? He talked about this Thanksgiving being different than what we've seen in the past, and just 2 months ago he talked about this COVID crisis being over as we know it.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. We've asked for $10 billion, I think 9.7 or something, but about $10 billion. It is less than what we had requested back in March, and that's because we have pulled resources from other things. I've talked to you about this from this podium. The really critical other public health needs that we have pulled resources from to buy vaccines, to buy treatments. Even the resources we're announcing today are from other really important programs. But that $10 billion is now critical. It is to make sure that we do have enough vaccines and treatments and tests to get Americans to a point where eventually, as this response changes and we more normalize vaccine treatment purchases through the regular health system, we want to make sure that we do that in an orderly way. We want to make sure that we got uninsured and underinsured Americans covered. So we obviously need resources for that. What you heard from Dr. Fauci is we are at a point where this virus continues to evolve very, very rapidly. And we updated the vaccines. They are working great right now. But the virus will continue to evolve, and at some point down the road next year, we're going to have to update the vaccines again. The truth is that for the long-run management of this virus, we need variant-resistant vaccines. We need vaccines that prevent transmission. What you have seen is China make a very large investment in mucosal vaccines because they understand that that's how you deal with respiratory viruses. America is falling behind on this really important technology. A major part of our request is for funding for public-private partnerships to move those kinds of technologies forward, to move a next generation of treatments forward. So we are trying to be prudent, obviously, in requesting resources that we think are absolutely essential and necessary. And all I can say is Congress needs to do its job and step up and protect the American people.
Thank you for allowing me to ask a question. Dr. Jha, my question simply has to do with vaccine mandates. Even if the vaccine is safe, even if the vaccine is effective, there's always been a question since the beginning, should they be mandated? Should people lose their jobs? Should military members be forced out of the service over these vaccine mandates? And to this day, I don't think the administration has backed away from those mandates. Is it fair at this point in the endemic to back away from vaccine mandates and do what you're doing today, which is simply encourage people to get their vaccines?
Yeah, so I think mandate decisions are always made at the local level so you can have, I have had a vaccine mandate that I have been subject to for 20 years for a flu vaccine, because as a physician, the hospital where I worked said I could not step foot on campus after I think like December 1st or something if I didn't have my flu vaccine. Was that appropriate? The hospital thought it was, because they said that's how we make sure we protect other healthcare workers and that's how we protect patients. So this idea that in specific circumstances, we can't have vaccine mandates, we've had them forever, right? George Washington had a vaccine mandate. Well, they weren't quite vaccines then, but they were inoculations against smallpox. This is as old as America. We've done this. The military decides what it needs to have a healthy fighting force. This is a decision up to our military leaders. Individual employers can make these decisions. So we've had a long history of this, of individual local decisions on these kinds of issues, and I think that is completely appropriate.
I just want to pick up the point that Dr. Fauci was making about misinformation. Under the stewardship of Elon Musk, Twitter seems to be welcoming back some people who spread COVID vaccine misinformation. Marjorie Taylor Greene's personal account is being reinstated, for example. Do you see that as a problem as you're trying to battle misinformation?
Well, as Dr. Fauci said, and it is something that we were speaking about earlier, the best way, I believe, to counter misinformation and disinformation is to spread good information, to spread science-based information, to have trusted voices. So I started my comments by reminding everybody that America's physicians, like the real leaders of American medicine, the people you trust for your cancer care and your heart care and your pediatrics care, are out there telling you need to go get a vaccine. You can decide to trust America's physicians, or you can trust some random dude on Twitter. Like, those are your choices. But I think the key here is to get trusted voices out there spreading truth, spreading science-based information. And for journalists and for people who run platforms, what I would say is you should be thinking about what your personal responsibility is. And do you want to be a source of misinformation and disinformation? That's up to those individuals, but I actually think it's really important for us, for me, to be spreading good information.
So Dr. Fauci said that it is not surprising there's this rebound effect with the flu this season. Why then does it seem like the country is caught so flat-footed by it?
What do you mean caught flat-footed by it?
People in this country are struggling to get basic antibiotics and antivirals. Why?
So I'm not sure so we have plenty of Paxlovid. I've not heard people struggling.
The flu and RSV.
So I don't know what antivirals you're thinking about for RSV. There aren't any that I'm aware of. There is a monoclonal that's for very, very high-risk children. We have that. We have plenty of that. So I don't think anybody's struggling. I'm not aware of anybody struggling to get the monoclonal for high-risk children, immunocompromised children.
There's a CNN headline today. Okay. Shortages of antivirals and antibiotics compound the stress of a rough season for viral illnesses in kids.
Again, I'd have to look at the specifics. What I would say is we often see shortages of individual antibiotics. I'm not aware of antivirals that are in shortage. The single most important thing that people need to do to protect themselves in this moment where we have a lot of flu, still have a decent amount of RSV, still got a good amount of COVID. The single most important thing people need to do is go get vaccinated. It keeps you out of the hospital. It keeps you from getting particularly sick. We have plenty of flu vaccines. We have plenty of COVID vaccines. We have plenty of COVID antivirals. As I said, I think the country is ready. We're ready to support hospitals that are getting into trouble. We have been working with jurisdictions over the last month, meeting with them. If hospitals need help, we've offered that, and we stand ready to help hospitals get through this moment.
So previously you talked about getting your vaccine or your booster before Halloween. We're now well past that. Is the administration behind on this? You're doing a 6-week sprint before the end of the year, but you were saying to get fully protected for the holidays, this already had to happen before. Why wasn't there this sprint, this outreach before, when it really would have had a bigger effect?
Well, no, so two things. First of all, we have been talking about this, I would say, pretty consistently for a couple of months now. And I was out here talking about people getting it before. Look, it's certainly not too late. If you think about the holidays that are coming, it takes a couple of weeks to get maximal benefits from your booster. You start getting it relatively quickly. People go out and get vaccinated this week. They will have a lot of protection during December, January, February onwards, the time that we socialize the most. So we have been doing a lot to keep vaccines and vaccinations happening. What we're doing now is redoubling that effort and making it very clear that people need to go out and get vaccinated.
Signal that the country's behind the 8 ball on getting boosted, though.
No, I think we've had slow, steady progress. But the bottom line is strong and steady progress. But the bottom line is we need more Americans vaccinated, and the weather's starting to get colder outside, as you can tell. And we know that this virus, in the last 2 years, each of the last 2 years, we've seen substantial increases late December into January. And so going out and getting vaccinated right now is a great way to protect yourself if that pattern holds.
The federal government purchased 171 million doses of this updated vaccine, and so far you've got 35 million into arms. That seems like a far cry from what the government has paid for. Is your expectation that you'll ever hit that 171?
Let's talk about the purchase we made. So first of all, our goal was to make sure we had enough vaccines for everybody. In rural areas, for instance, you end up having to deal with the fact that you might have a vial of 5 doses and are only able to give out 3. So that's always something that we factor in, right? Second is over time, there will be updates. FDA may, and again, I don't want to get ahead of FDA, at some point make a decision that the bivalent vaccine is what you want to use as a primary series. When FDA makes that decision, if they make that decision, we want to make sure we have plenty of vaccines for that. So we have made these purchases thinking across all of the ways in which Americans will need vaccines, and have made decisions to make sure there are plenty of vaccines available for Americans wherever they are, in rural areas, in urban areas. And I think that was a really good decision to make sure that there's plenty of access, no matter how our vaccine usage shifts.
I don't know what the numbers are for the flu, but are you expecting that year after year, some number of Americans will get their updated vaccine, and what number are you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, so we don't have a target. At this moment, I do believe that given where we are with COVID and the evolution of this virus, I do expect that for majority of Americans, they will need an annual COVID vaccine to have maximal protection. If you think about it, a majority of Americans were eligible for a booster last fall. If they got it last fall, they're eligible again this fall. There's been a lot of it's hard to make specific predictions about this virus, but all the science and all the evidence we have suggests that we're probably going to need to update our vaccine again next year, and have Americans get vaccinated again next year. Right now, our focus is let's get Americans protected this fall and winter with the updated COVID vaccines we have.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Jha. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jha. Just one thing at the top, and then we can get going with some questions. Since this weekend's tragic shooting in Colorado Springs, we've learned more about those killed in the senseless attack. All started their Saturday night like so many Americans, going to work, going out with friends and families, but lives were cut short by senseless and an act of violence. Kelly Long had just turned 40 last week. Her sister remembered her publicly as and I quote, wonderful person who was loving and caring and sweet and always put others before herself. A friend of Kelly's recalled her being supportive and selfless and had looked forward to seeing her for Thanksgiving this week. Danielle Austin Austin was just 28 years old. He was a bartender and entertainer at Club Q who overcame being teased by peers in school as a child and found joy in performing. Daniel's mother, Sabrina, was one of his biggest fans and would bring friends and family to his performance at Club Q. She said, and quote, lit up a room. He lit up a room. Derek Rump was also just 38 years old. His friends told the Washington Post that Derek was, quote, what made Club Q, end quote. A bartender, performer, and an avid Britney Spears fan. Friends and customers remembered Derek for making everyone feel welcome at Club Q. They talked about his positivity, kindness, and generosity, recalling he had a heavy, poor, and was a great listener. But Derek helped people outside Club Q too. When the pandemic hit and some of his friends and colleagues struggled with rent and groceries, Derek stepped in to help. Ashley Paw, her sister, remembered Ashley as a loving mother and wife who leaves behind an 11-year-old daughter. Ashley's sister described her as being a devoted mom for whom her daughter was at the center of her life. She spoke about the hole that will exist for their family this Thanksgiving and forever after. Raymond Green Vance was only 22 years